As Melanie mentioned, this is the fourth in a series of presentations or workshops all on fundraising and communication related topics. Last month, we talked about generative AI and AI tools and ethical AI use. Today, we really want to talk about this idea of most of you, I suspect, in extension, don't want to put all of your funding into one type of basket, right? So many of you, I'm confident, are very experienced, actively working on federal or state grants of some type. And those are really important. We'll talk about that today. My goal with this conversation is to give you some additional perspective about potential other avenues that might be available to you when it comes to continuing to deliver the beneficial outcomes to your clients and to the communities that you serve. I come at this conversation from the perspective of someone who is a trained journalist and fundraising and communications consultant. I previously, before I started my consulting firm, worked for Farm Journal, and I can remember a particular set of circumstances that required me to really sort of step things up. And that is when our executive team went into USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service and said, hey, if we can come up with $1 million from the private sector, would you be willing to put up an additional $1 million to move forward a project around conservation and farmers, helping farmers to continue to engage in conservation topics, learn about new opportunities available to them, and move that forward on their farm operations? And so USDA said, yes, we're open to the idea. Show us the money and we can talk. And so I'll give you the end of that story at the end of our session today, but that is the challenge and the opportunity in front of each of us, which is there are lots of exciting opportunities when we start to think creatively and divergently about how to fund our work, and yet it can be really overwhelming and it can be unclear where to go first, second, and third. So I will give you at the very start of this my bias as we go into sort of the learning objectives for today. My deepest experience comes from working on public-private partnerships between the federal government, NGOs, corporations, etc. I have done work for private philanthropy, and so I have a little bit of a mixed bag of experience. And while I wouldn't qualify myself as an expert in all of these fields, what I'm hoping to do today is give you some new questions to be thinking about as you go back to your arm of extension, as you think about the colleagues and the partners that you collaborate with. At the very end of this conversation, my hope is that you'll walk away with some tangible things to think about, some next steps to consider, again, to make sure that you're able to continue and perhaps even expand at some point the great work you're doing across extension. We do want this to be interactive, so I look forward to your questions and comments in the chat. And I'll pause throughout the session today to get your thoughts on some specific questions. And then as Melanie mentioned, our goal is to leave roughly 20-25 minutes toward the end for Q&A. So as we embark on this topic today of diversifying your funding streams, I want to first walk you through some novel sources of funding. None of these will be a shock to any of you, and some of them, frankly, may not be applicable at all, but I encourage you to keep an open mind because it may spark creative thinking for types of funding that are a really good fit for you. Secondly, I want to consider and compare and contrast a little bit some of the grant-based funding you may be very familiar with to some of the alternative funding streams, pros, cons, just considerations to make, right? There's nothing negative about any of these funding opportunities we're going to talk about today. And in fact, I think there's a lot of positive things to be said about each of them, but you have to develop your own fundraising strategy or in collaboration with those you serve. But again, giving you hopefully a more detailed or more nuanced lay of the land may be helpful to you. And then finally, I mentioned that I'm going to have some frameworks or questions. I can't today give you specific, tangible, go to this funder for this opportunity or go to that, because each of you is very unique as a professional within your specific section of extension. But what I can do is give you some tools and resources for how to think about these topics to really get the most value, and I also hope give you more confidence in pursuing funding that is meaningful and helpful to achieving the outcomes you're working toward. So before we dive in fully, I want to ask this question to the group and encourage you to type into the chat. What is your current level of comfort and experience with non-government grants? So, outside of USDA or Department of Health and Human Services or other agencies that might provide federal funding, what is your level of comfort or experience in sort of pursuing some of these non-government funding sources? Awesome. Jennifer, thank you. I see no experience with grants at all. That's totally fine. Fairly comfortable. Reagan, thank you. No experience, none. Excellent. Okay, private foundations, that's fantastic. Very little experience, private grants. No experience yet. I love the word yet because that suggests the opportunities are ahead of you. The best is yet to be. Comfortable, lots of local grant experience. Excellent. Okay, so we have quite a spectrum here, which is exciting to me. Again, I hope there's something for everyone here. And again, Patty, some experience would like to expand. Love it. Okay, let's try to get you some additional insights that might be helpful. Melanie introduced me earlier. Again, my primary background, the examples I'll share today, primarily stem from food, agriculture, and conservation, just because that's the space I've worked in. But again, you can apply the kinds of things I'll be talking about today to any industry or academic discipline. Okay, so let me just break down for you the sort of core funding I'm going to focus on today. I know many of you have not worked on grants at all, or even from the state and federal grant standpoint, you may not be familiar with all of those components. I'll mention that today a little bit, but I'm going to primarily talk about alternatives, only because there is some level of baseline understanding of federal and state grants in the room here today. But again, those who have experience in federal and state grants, if there are those here who are not familiar, as I saw in the chat, feel free to type in ideas, perspectives, sort of bouncing off of what I'm sharing here, because I think we can all learn together. So first of all, corporations. Here I'm talking about for-profit businesses that are looking to fund impact-driven work. Along the top row of boxes here beneath each of these titles, I've sort of given some very high-level descriptions of why each of these organizations or types of funding exists, right? What is the purpose? And then along the bottom row of boxes, I've given just a handful of random examples that I came up with from my own world of food, agriculture, climate change, just to give you some sense of, okay, here's what this actually looks like in the real world. On the corporation side, I would say, broadly speaking, when it comes to any sort of funding arrangement, whether it's between U.S. Department of Agriculture and a university, or the Walmart Foundation and a nonprofit, all of those entities have outcomes they're driving toward, right? You as an extension professional want to be able to deliver education and outreach in specific areas, whether it's nutrition, whether it's agriculture, whether it's health, beyond. In the same way, the federal government, for example, wants to be able to demonstrate within a specific agency like USDA or the Health and Human Services that funding that has been allocated by Congress, for example, has been put to work on behalf of taxpayers as Congress intended. And so each party in a funding arrangement of any kind across the board has that outcome in mind, right? We want to make, expand access to climate smart agriculture funding and resources for farmers and those who serve them, would be a hypothetical example. And at the same time, in a federal agency, you are trying to report back to Congress or leaders that have allocated funding. If you are an extension professional helping put those federal programs to work, you want to be able to report back to those who fund extension and talk about the impact that you're having. And so any funding arrangement has both self-interest, naturally, because you need to be demonstrating the value you provide individually, organizationally, And also you're moving towards specific outcomes that benefit society at large or a specific audience within society at large. And so I think that framing is really important because when it comes to engaging with corporations or private philanthropy, you are all working toward a specific outcome, but you also have to, within the grant proposal or the funding, letter of intent, you have to articulate the value to the individual funder you want to work with. And so I think it's easy to say, to sort of pitch or propose projects, programs of work that only address the outcome. But it's really important before you even get there to frame the outcome in language and in the priorities of the individual funding entity. Again, not everyone is excited about that message because it sounds a little bit selfish or perhaps even conceited to say that we're just going to try to appease this specific funder. But the reality is we have our own organizational objectives in addition to the outcome we're working toward. It can all work really nicely together. But again, that a lot of that comes in the leadership of that grant program or the proposal you're developing and in the language you use to describe it. So for corporations, a lot of them are primarily driven by a few different things. You know, they often have specific philanthropic interests. And so some companies will have the for-profit arm, you know, think about Walmart having its retail stores, et cetera. But then they also have a separate foundation, right? So there are two entities, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. You may be starting out at the corporation and ending up with the foundation, right? Where the funding actually takes place for the kinds of benefit-driven work that you're doing. Overall, though, there is often alignment between a company and its foundation. For example, many companies today on the environmental side are looking to address specific ESG goals they've set, right? Environment, social, and governance related, whether that's, you know, drawing down greenhouse emissions, mitigating risks from climate change, things of that nature. And so, again, when you're thinking about approaching a corporation or a corporation foundation, understanding the way they view the world and the priorities they have becomes really important. And again, I've listed examples of corporations or quasi-corporate entities that historically, you know, provide funding. Crowdfunding may not be applicable to this group, but I wanted to include it anyway. You know, when I first thought of crowdfunding, you typically hear about that on, you know, Facebook or Instagram, right? People who are maybe undergoing a serious medical condition and looking to raise funding from friends and supporters. You might think of entrepreneurs who are creating a new product and trying to get initial seed capital to start something like that. It's also a really popular platform for, I spend a lot of time in the book and author world. And many times independently published authors are actually crowdfunding from readers, from others who support their work to be able to fund printing of the initial round of books, to be able to support their marketing efforts, to pay for their cover. So again, maybe not a one-to-one to what you do at Extension, but nonetheless, depending on, I think at minimum, it helps us expand our creative thinking, right? Who are the people, the organizations, of course, but also are there individuals who might support the work of Extension? And then private philanthropy, again, oftentimes motivated by a specific family's legacy, right? The kinds of issues they care about, whether it's environment or poverty or environmental justice. And many times foundations have multiple priorities that are aligned in some ways, as you all know who have worked in this space very deeply. And again, just a handful of examples that I've listed beneath there. You know, nonprofits are beneficial and I think heuristically helpful to you as extension professionals because oftentimes, especially mid to global nonprofits have very clear, easily searchable online mission, values, specific work streams that are aligned on addressing specific issues in society that may make it easier than some of these others like private philanthropy to quickly ascertain, is this NGO aligned with our priorities within Extension? And if so, they may give you the language, the framing to actually put together a letter of intent or a query around potentially receiving funding to work together. There are some overarching principles to keep in mind with any of these diverse funding streams. And I would call your attention first to the orange box here in the right-hand corner. Whether you are going after a private philanthropy or a corporate foundation or a nonprofit, relationship building, actually getting to know some of the people behind the scenes, creativity or divergent thinking, understanding what you're working toward within extension, being able to speak about that in a way that's going to resonate with a funder. And then finally, making sure you are visible to an organization, right? How do you elevate the work and the impact that extension has? How do you elevate your expertise and the specific ways in which you connect the dots uniquely and effectively to make change in the world? Those elements are really critical no matter what type of funding you might be seeking. And the other thing I'll call out, which again is not a popular message to hear, but I would say with the vast majority of these, and there may be exceptions, this work is going to take time, right? And before it takes time, it's going to take strategy. And so, we'll go through some specific questions in a few moments that may be helpful to you in sort of developing what your strategic interest is in pursuing diverse funding streams. But just know that it's going to take time, and that's okay, right? You're going to learn along the way. And not everyone is going to say yes to funding you. But I am convinced the more I work with my clients and the more I see case studies in the real world, that the more disciplined approach, the more you get clear on what you're going to say yes to and what you're going to say no to, that allows you to really focus in on those key opportunities, the more successful you're going to be in the long term, not only building those relationships, but eventually becoming competitive at seeking funding in these areas. A few final notes on this slide. I think number one is connection, right? On the far right-hand side of this little chart. If you haven't read the book Who, Not How by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy, I highly recommend it. Again, the name of that book is Who, Not How. The book is not designed for extension or universities or the academic world specifically, but I think it has great bearing in any area of life. It's definitely transformed how I think about my life and business. The premise of the book is this, and I've probably mentioned it on past sessions. The world is going so fast. There's so much information to digest, especially when it comes to funding and making progress within your area of extension, that you could spend multiple lifetimes learning all of the nuances, the ins and outs of securing funding, right? What are all the documents? What are all the right things to say or not to say? And certainly AI is helpful in thinking outside the box and maybe shortcutting some of that process, and that benefit will grow. At the same time, finding human experts who've been down this road. P.S. Lots of your extension colleagues in the room today have expertise in very specific areas of diverse funding. The faster you're going to be able to see success and get traction. So in any case, always first focus on who do I know, either within extension, across our partnership network, or within existing funding organizations that might be able to help me better understand and answer. If I only had answers to these three key questions, I can make the next step. I can make the next decision. Look for those people. That's really important. Other factors to keep in mind, complexity, right? Just because these funding avenues exist doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get funded any faster if you pursue any one of them. So keep in mind, one of the benefits that I've seen, engaging NGOs, engaging private philanthropy, in some cases at least, is that the administrative threshold is much lower compared to a major federal grant, for example. Not always the case, but there are sometimes reduced paperwork burden, less time in the planning process. Again, some organizations will require sort of basic boilerplate about your organization, understanding your sort of objectives and outcomes desired, what outputs are you going to be delivering. So again, some are very streamlined in that respect, some are much more complex. So keep that complexity factor in mind. It may be you're willing to undergo some complexity because the funding level is so high. it may be that having a relationship with that really well-known entity would look really great as you're going out to secure other funding or pursuing specific projects. And so again, all of these are fine. It just points to the need to have a written strategy and to have some conversations internally within your area of extension to get clear on your values and your goals. Speed is another issue, right? If there is reduced complexity, there may also be increased speed to prepare a proposal or to get a meeting with that funding organization or to be funded, right? For those who've worked on federal and state grants, there's often sort of an RFP, right? And so you have so many days or weeks to review a proposal opportunity and prepare your package. Then there's a waiting period while those proposals are reviewed internally. Then there's an award announcement. Then there's a waiting period, and then funding is eventually given to start the work. So, and again, depending on the organization, whether private philanthropy or nonprofit, some of those steps may also be in place, but those waiting periods may be significantly reduced. So again, just something to keep in mind. And then finally, solicited versus unsolicited, right? With federal or state RFPs, again, within the limitations that are described in the RFP, anyone can go and pursue that funding, assuming they're eligible, which makes it, it's easy to locate, it's easy to understand the criteria. Sometimes, maybe not always, right? You may have to solicit some help in interpreting. But as you get into private philanthropy, for example, it can be challenging, right? It may not have a lot of publicly available information on that family foundation. You may need a software or tool to help you locate that, or find someone who knows that organization really well to learn from. And some organizations aren't open to unsolicited proposals. So you have to really be attentive to the interests, the needs, and the here's what we don't want list of some of these organizations. Okay, so let me take a pause there. I've dumped a lot of information on you. I'm curious, many people in this room don't have a lot of deep experience in some of these funding areas. So what is most interesting to you and why? I think a lot of times it's easy to say like the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, right? Like we've tapped out these grant opportunities. What else is out there? Or, we think we have great potential in this program we're working on, and we really want to pursue this type of funding because fill in the blank. So what are some of the reasons that are driving you? What are you most curious about? Excellent. Jenny, thank you for your question. I will come back to that. Okay, what is available besides state and federal? Excellent. Yep, just wanting to understand the landscape in general. And for many of you, you may not exactly have a clear hypothesis on what type of funding you want to pursue, and that is totally okay as well. Reagan private philanthropy, less onerous reporting, scope of work may be more flexible. Definitely something I've seen and experienced for sure. Michelle, climate education related sources, absolutely. So funding organizations that are focused on a specific topic or issue, love that. All right, excellent. So let's go ahead and dive into the next set of sort of planning guidelines that I'd like to offer to this group, and keep those comments in the chat coming. Okay, wanting to understand, Jennifer, tools that are available to find grants by state. Okay, we'll come back to that question. Partnering with different types of funding options, absolutely. So we'll come back to those topics and questions during the Q&A, but those are all really important things to be asking and to be looking for. And there are resources to help, so we'll come back to that for sure. Okay, so I've mentioned a couple of times, I think personally having a written strategy for your sort of funding and grants research is really important. So let me give you some concrete things to be thinking about when it comes to developing that strategy. I mentioned who, not how earlier. And so I think there are at least 3 different core pillars of any funding diversification strategy. And it really breaks down into these 3 areas. 1, who's going to research on the left-hand side? Who's going to research alternative funding opportunities? I'll have a slide here in a few moments. There are some really great tools, some of which I know many of you are using within Extension. Grant Station is one that I know is popular for looking at grant opportunities. Grants.gov, if you're looking at federal opportunities in particular, is like the go-to. I use a tool for my consulting practice called Instrumental, which is a paid AI-driven research tool that covers state and federal grants, private philanthropy, nonprofits, corporations, and corporate foundations. Again, there are many different options. I have my own biases on which ones I prefer, but again, there are opportunities. But at this point, you can't just ask even an AI powered tool like find me everything I need to know, right? You need to have a human in the driver's seat saying these are our criteria, and bringing some of these opportunities to the table, whether you're a one person shop or you've got multiple partners and colleagues you can work with. Secondly, it takes someone, and this may be actually many of you on this call today, right? You're sort of leading this effort to think critically about funding opportunities. You know your programs and services really, really well within Extension. You need someone on your team who can be thinking about existing streams of work that you're already doing, perhaps programs of work that have gone dormant that you think could be brought back to life in a really powerful way. And then finally, novel new programs that you'd love to expand or fine tune or build on. This piece is really important because it's really your core offering. It's your value proposition. Yes, these are the outcomes that these funders want. Those outcomes are also what Extension wants. So how are we going to get there? How are we going to measure it? So someone who can really think through the aspects of a program or how you might modify or expand on something you're already doing and present that to a funder is really essential. And then the final piece of your team, I think, ought to be someone who is going to be building and growing funder relationships, right? Again, this idea of who, not how. Someone who is always thinking about very connected, someone who's going to industry conferences and events, someone who knows the Extension system, someone who's engaged with partners outside of Extension. Again, this can sound very overwhelming, but I think it's often just a matter of sort of starting with your core group, right? Who do I know within my university who could be who could provide insights or connect me to other people who might have funding or opportunities? What events am I already participating in? Virtual, face-to-face, trainings, conferences, professional development. Who could I connect with that might be able to shortcut my learning curve? And then, of course, someone who's actually setting meetings, right? Virtually, in person. One strategy I really loved in a past life working for Farm Journal was actually saying, okay, we're going to go to Washington, D.C. We're already going to be there for a business trip. And so we're going to set up as many meetings as we can with prospective funding partners, groups that are doing this kind of work that are very aligned with us. And I think the same applies for Extension. And again, you may not travel a lot. You may not travel at all, but I suspect you have people in your network who are getting out and about, either in person or virtually. And again, that connections can lead to conversations. And that's really what you're after, is building that relationship, getting to know those funders, and also helping them get to know you and the value that Extension is so great at delivering. All right. Once you have that sort of core team defined for your grants or your funding diversification strategy, then I think the next question to ask is, what are our guardrails? What are the criteria we're going to use to really hone in on specific funding types and funding opportunities? For example, some hypothetical questions you might ask could be, are we only going to respond to active or historic RFPs? So this can be a great strategy if you are pursuing federal or state grants, right? So you know that, for example, USDA every year is going to announce the RCPP program or specific, conservation programs focused on farmers, or NEFA is going to announce specific research opportunities. And you know that typically, again, assuming congressional funding and appropriations and all of those things, about September or about the fall, this is going to be announced. That's a great strategy because it's predictable. You can really get to know the ins and outs of that RFP and shortcut, the learning curve over a period of years. You can really fine tune your value proposition and take feedback from reviewers and make each proposal incrementally or dramatically stronger. Um, Another strategy on the opposite side of this chart on the right hand corner is you can build custom design projects that extension alone is capable of delivering. So some organizations love to pursue this strategy because perhaps the funding organization has never seen something quite like what they're able to do. They've really studied the landscape very clearly, the kinds of education and outreach that are already happening. And because of the skill sets, the people, the expertise you bring, the data or insights you offer, you can deliver something that's brand new. And so some organizations may be taking a little bit more of a risk, but the reward can also be greater because, again, if you're building something from scratch, if you find that right funding partner who really understands the outcome you're after, they may say, I want to invest in that. I want to be a part of that journey. Another path that is sort of the middle of the line is doing a little bit of both, right? You may decide that as part of your funding strategy, you're going to go after federal grants, sure, but also you're going to look really critically at private philanthropy opportunities. Maybe there's a foundation or two you've met in the past or that you've heard a colleague talk about. And so you may decide to spend, you know, 80% of your time on the grant side and 20% exploring this new line of funding, which would be, private foundation, private philanthropy. Again, the decision is ultimately yours or those of your colleagues, but these are the kinds of questions you can ask to really save yourself time in the long run and be as effective as possible and invest time wisely. In terms of, as once you've got your sort of written strategy in place, then it comes down to individual opportunities, right? Specific RFPs, specific unique programs that you want to propose. The first aspect or the first tranche that I would advise you thinking about is sort of, okay, let me understand the funder specifically, right? What is their timeline? Do they accept applications on a rolling basis? Or is there a fixed point in time in 30 days? Like, do we even have capacity or time to respond to this? Historically, is this organization's funding going up or down? What is the median level of funding that they're allocating to specific grantees? One of the biggest risks that I see organizations take in this, in pursuing diverse funding is that their eyes are bigger than their stomach, right? And I suffer from the same thing, whether it's at the dinner table or when it comes to, fundraising. So it's really exciting. You see an RFP for awards that are $500,000 or more, or one giant prize that's $100 million. And that can seem really enticing, understandably. That could do a lot of good with the work you're doing within Extension. On the other hand, if you don't have the fortitude, the intestinal fortitude to say we're going to push pause or dial down our work on some of these activities to invest staff time, resources, expertise in, pulling together the proposal, securing letters of support, letters of commitment. What you do is you burn out people on their existing projects, and you have a subpar proposal. And so if you can somehow find a way to dial it in, really understand your criteria for, we need at least 90 days to submit a really great proposal, or we need an action team that is dialed in when a short-term funding opportunity becomes available, and they know they have permission to drop this in order to do that. Again, these are things to think about. I don't see many people doing it, but I think if we had more of a strategic approach, there would be more calm, more ability to tap into your creative thinking, and happier people across any organization. This is not Extension specific. This is just any organization that's pursuing funding of this type. Then again, evaluating relationship strength. I won't belabor this one. We've already talked about the importance of who you know. So again, if you're going into a specific funding opportunity, the odds are you may have a stronger case to make if you've had some connectivity within that agency or organization. Again, any funding organization is going to remain objective to the degree humanly possible. But again, having those connections can give you visibility into how those funders think, the criteria they use to select funding, the kinds of tweaks or nuances you might need to bring to your proposal to make it speak their language. The next piece here is team capacity. Again, we've already mentioned that. How committed is your team to other projects? Like, do you have the ability to take on this funding opportunity? And then determine your go or no-go points, right? Who has the ultimate authority within your section of extension to say, yes, we're pursuing this, or no, we're not? Or on the other hand, we're 50% of the way through and they say, pump the brakes. This is not going in the right direction. It's not a good investment of resources. And by when, right? Setting some concrete timelines or milestones can really help you be effective in this process, guide your decisions, and help you prioritize first, second, and third steps. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick preview of what I'm going to be talking about next, and then I'm going to pause and see if there are any comments or thoughts in the chat. I'm going to next share with you some key questions, starting with specific types of corporations or corporate philanthropy, and then moving through the other types of funding we described. I'm going to give you some specific questions you can work through within your area of extension. And I think they're going to help you build smarter proposals. They're going to help you think more creatively about where funding might come from, and they're going to help you avoid pitfalls that are very common. But for any of those types of funding, I think these 3 points are especially important. The very first thing you need to do is really study the mission of the funding organization that you're considering reaching out to. So are they aligned with your mission, right, in some capacity? Many nonprofits, family foundations have several different streams of work, right? So they might have a health focus, a climate change focus, and local communities, municipalities focus, right? Hypothetically. You don't have to align with everything, right? Your goal is to get as niche down and focused as possible. If you check multiple boxes, fantastic. But the odds are, in many cases, you're probably going to be focusing on one of those areas very heavily, maybe with alignment or talking about how you also, as an extension entity, address some of those other boxes. But again, making sure you're aligned in mission, that your value system, that your ethics are aligned is really, really important. Because again, there are lots of organizations giving funding, but not all of them are going to be a great fit for you. Secondly, assessing connection. Again, who do you already know there? Who do you know that knows someone there? And if you don't, it's not a deal breaker. It just means that you might need to do a little bit of background homework, some reading, some watching videos, or getting to know them, or understanding their grantees and maybe having conversations with a few of them just to understand how they think about the world, the kinds of work they prioritize. And then finally, consider optics, right? So this is one that's easy to overlook. I think extension is very aware and self-aware, which is very important. Are there ethical, legal, or other factors in the mix that could make going after this funding a poor fit? What I'm thinking about in this case, or what I would encourage you to be thinking about, is if the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Des Moines Register were writing a story on page 1 about the fact that we've been awarded this funding, would we feel great about it, right? There are organizations that I would say are politically neutral, that are really focused on the social benefits. And there are other organizations that have a very specific framing, how they view the world, right? Whether it's politically right-leaning, politically left-leaning, or anywhere across that spectrum. And so again, I know you all are professionals, you think about these kinds of things, but the optics piece is important not to overlook, because something may be perfectly legal and funding may be available and you may go through all the right hoops. But at the end of the day, if there is something out of sync with the values you have as an extension professional, with the kinds of work you do, with how you approach the clients you serve, you don't want to get into a situation where you receive that funding, you make the announcement is made, and then you're out of step from a value standpoint with the funder. So again, people often get big eyes and excitement about funding opportunities, which again, I do the same thing. Just something to keep in mind that will really prevent heartache down the road. Okay, let me stop there. I'm going to jump into corporate here in just a moment, but happy to take any questions or comments in the chat. How is this hitting you? Are you finding this to be something that is filling you with hope or filling you with dread, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Would love to just get a read of the room as to this idea of diverse funding opportunities, knowing that these opportunities exist. All right, that's okay. You may be sitting back and saying, wow, Nate is completely overwhelming me. I don't know where to begin to think about this. And that is okay. I'll try to close the loop as we wrap into this. And yeah, I see Reagan's comment. Thrilled for this now if I could only find the time. Yes, that is always the challenge. I do think that, again, even if you dedicated 15 minutes a week, right? Say 5 minutes a week to thinking about one of these questions, right? And again, Melanie has graciously agreed to share these slides, so you'll have copies of all of these questions to sort of think through. The most important thing, I think, before searching for funders or putting together a proposal is like, what is so important to us about going after this funding, right? Why does this matter? And if you can define that, then I think you've got a lot more clarity. Need to work on the collaboration piece. Yes, that is, again, partnership, thinking broadly about the people and organizations that can be partners in this effort, really important. There was a second question beyond why are we doing this in the first place? The question might be, who do I know that I would want to be, who would I want on my team in a perfect world, right? Wave a magic wand. It could be with an extension. It could be within the partners that you serve. It could be a really awesome client that you've had the privilege of helping. That could be a really good thought partner to you, right? These are not necessarily people that have cash that they're ready to pull out of their wallets. But these are people whose expertise, whose value system, whose creative thinking, whose bravery in asking for help would be really beneficial to you, right? Make a list of those people. I think those two things can be really beneficial as you start diving deeper into specific strategy for this funding search. Okay, so let me just leave you with some key questions to ask as we get ready to move into our Q&A toward the end of our session today. And again, as you have questions, drop those in the chat. I will ask Melanie to sort of call out some of those later on to make sure we get as many of them answered as possible. And if we don't have time to answer all of them, I hope you'll reach out to me via email or phone and we can talk further. Okay, so corporate funding or foundations that corporations have set up. The first thing to do to not waste your time, right, is to make sure that this entity provides funding beyond sponsorship. So I think most of you here are very familiar with this idea, but just briefly, many companies want their logo on stuff, to be totally candid. And so, and I love them for that. So companies want to be seen doing good things in their community. And many companies are awesome if let's say you're hosting a workshop that's organized by Extension. Companies can be fantastic for paying for food or providing notebooks and pens for event attendees to make notes with or what have you. And there are lots of other ways organizations can provide value to Extension on a small scale. The problem I have is that a lot of the research tools that are out there will pull up these, what you think is a grant opportunity, but in fact is a sponsorship. If you read the fine print, it's like, we'll provide you with complimentary copies of our software for bookkeeping, or, we'll provide you with something under $1,000 to host a local event. And again, those things can be really meaningful, but the core of our conversation today is around more meaningful, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in funding, ideally, right? So again, just make sure you understand, like historically, you can look back at data, you can ask funding entities questions with this regard, like, should we even bother to submit a proposal to you at this value, given what you historically have funded? Again, those are all very fair questions to ask in a professional, polite way. Secondly, it's important to understand process, right? So you may end up engaging a corporation. Let's say you engage with the marketing and communications team at a major corporation, and they end up, based on the nature of the questions that you're asking or the type of program you want to propose, they may say, hey, this is not our line of work. We keep very a firewall between our company and our foundation. let me refer you to this person, or let me help you with an email introduction to person X. Um, so just understanding the process, right? You should be able to ascertain quite a bit just looking at public websites. Um, some folks have a philanthropy page or an investor page of some kind, and you may be able to understand those demarcations. But when in doubt, ask, right? And they can point you to the right direction. Um, and then I guess finally, theory of change. I mentioned that there are many companies today that are investing in philanthropy either because of the family legacy of the people that founded that company and its foundation. There are specific commitments they've made to their investors or shareholders, or just they're just that is sort of wired into their ethic, right? They care about climate change, they care about racial justice, whatever the case might be. Taking some time to do your homework and understanding their theory of change. Like companies don't use in most cases, they won't say theory of change, but what do they believe is needed to make society a better place? And does that align with what you do at Extension? Again, the goal here is to save you time, only engaging organizations that are very aligned in mission and purpose, and not going to, quote unquote, pull a fast one. I think the vast majority of companies and organizations want to do the right thing, but they may come at it from different ways that are incompatible with what you do. And in some cases, there is, again, any organization can suffer from dishonesty or problems like that. So just try to understand up front, see how they've been covered in the media. Again, that's not always accurate, but it may give you some data points to work with. And then the last thing I want to leave you with on corporations, and someone mentioned in the chat earlier, partnership. I'll give you the end of my story earlier when we said, hey, USDA, we'll come up with $1 million. But matching on grants can be a really powerful way to begin that relationship with for-profit companies. Federal agency, USDA says, we've got this great program. For every dollar that the government puts into this program, we want you to find $1 from the private sector. And so, again, there may be specific things that companies are willing to provide cash or value in terms of the expertise of their tools or software. But there are lots of ways, and oftentimes companies want people to ask them, but they've never been approached, or they don't know where to begin, or the nature of the ask was so vague or broad that it didn't feel like a strong fit. But again, this often starts with just building relationships with individuals, right? Often at the executive level, right? At the vice president, C-suite kind of level, whether that's in business development or sustainability, or again, think about the specific type of work you want to be doing, and then what executive titles would match that. But again, that's a process. It takes time, but there can be really powerful collaborations and partnerships that may not materialize at first, but as you get to know each other better, as you build trust, there may be opportunities to work together. And for companies, alignment with a federal agency or an alignment with extension, with academic level education, outreach, research can be really powerful and credentialing for them. And they also believe and know they have value to offer you and the outcomes you're working toward. So again, this can be a very virtuous collaboration. It just takes some creativity and some trust building. Again, crowdfunding, probably not super relevant for this group, but I'll just go over this broadly. Some funding opportunities, like this is a section I pulled off of Kickstarter's website. Can nonprofits raise funds for projects? In this case, Kickstarter's policy is yes, a nonprofit entity can use a Kickstarter, but whatever you're producing through the Kickstarter campaign has to be publicly shareable and very specific. So if you're getting funding and then you go behind closed doors and only share the product or the output that you've developed with a secret group of people, then sorry, you're not eligible. So again, just reading the fine print will give you a lot of clarity around specific funding and whether it's a good fit or not. Consider the optics. Again, with a Kickstarter or something like this, I think the worst case scenario would be to come across as, needy, or hey, like the university system or the state legislature or Congress is not meeting our needs, so we're going to try to go out and sort of do a workaround. Again, there are probably very ethical honest ways to broach something like this, but you just need to be careful. And then finally, accountability, right? With a Kickstarter or any sort of crowdfunding, um, there's a lot that entrepreneurs, for example, have to do to, demonstrate like, hey, we said we needed this dollar amount. We said we were going to do this, and here's the evidence of how that happened, right? So, as with a grant fund, where you're going to go back and say, this is what we invested, this is how we followed the rules, this is the budget we set out, this is how we fulfilled that budget, these are the outcomes or the data points we captured demonstrating impact. The same is true for this type of funding as well, albeit you're going to bear more of the responsibility for actually doing all the administrative pieces, organizing that, owning it, explaining it to your constituents. Private philanthropy, I know someone mentioned on this, like, how do I even find sort of non-grant or outside of the box funding opportunities? Honestly, short of, working with someone who knows that space really well. For example, if there's a grants consultant broadly or a grants consultant specializing in agriculture or whatever area you work in, that's a great approach. Another tool I actually recommend even more than that is like one of these tools, right? So Grant Station, I mentioned I have a bias. I use Instrumental. And again, it's the best source I found for sort of compiling all of this into one place and really getting very granular. So you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, I've been able to had the privilege of getting to work with some folks within Extension on some projects and, picking criteria like, is this program only in the state of Delaware or is it nationwide? Do I want private philanthropy or only federal grants? So being able to really dive deeply can be really valuable. And then, finally, pace yourself, right? Instead of going through all of the opportunities, like diving into one opportunity specifically or one type of funding option can be a powerful way to start. I have a couple more slides to go, but I want to mention before I do, Melanie has dropped into the chat a survey about today's session. This is for Extension Foundation to help them make sure that these workshops are meaningful and helpful. So please take a moment while you're listening in the background to fill out that survey. I'll have a survey of my own in a minute that's completely optional, though I'd value your input. But again, go ahead and look in the chat, find that link that Melanie dropped in, and go ahead and fill out that survey. That will help Extension Foundation serve you in the future. When it comes to nonprofits, a few quick strategies to think about. Studying Form 990s, right? I love ProPublica's free Nonprofit Explorer. You can actually type in the name of the nonprofit you want to know more about. You'll get access to historic Form 990s, which is the tax form nonprofits must submit to the federal government. It has details on the contractors they've hired, the kinds of grants they do, who's on their board, any sort of other notes or details on the mission or how the language they use to describe what they do, which can be powerful when you're writing a letter of intent or trying to get a meeting for the first time. Analyze the scope of the work they do. Some nonprofits and private philanthropy are very specific. They only do, one year projects or one-time projects, and that's it. They expect you to sustain it on your own in the future. Others do large multi-year kind of work. And then, one thing I like to do, which is not a fail-safe, but I think it's a good idea, is what I call the website sniff test. Like, check out that nonprofit's website and see how prominently they are talking about the issue that you're trying to get a grant or funding for, right? So whether it's climate change or the environment or water, if they're not featuring this prominently on their website, then chances are probably pretty good that your ask is going to be made much more difficult, right? So just make sure that whatever you're going after aligns with the publicly stated priorities of that organization. All right, so we're now going to move into Q&A. I've dumped a lot of information on you. You've been very gracious and engaged. So with this, I'm going to ask you a couple of things. First, if you could fill out Melanie's survey, and then if you have a moment to fill out the one I've got on the screen here for me. Again, this just gives me feedback and make sure these sessions are as valuable as possible. Let's go into the chat. I'm going to take a breather and get a drink of water. And then Melanie, I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the questions or topics that have popped up in the chat that I might be helpful in answering.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for all this information. So for those who didn't hear the introduction, that these sessions go 15 minutes past the hour. So we'll be using these next 15 minutes or so just to answer your questions and take your comments and everything. So the first thing that I see, is there any other grant aggregator sites that folks use? And Jamie linked what she uses in the chat, but that would be great if we could collect, any websites that people use, and Nate, anything that you use as well, I'll capture.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Jamie, and everyone. Thank you for the comments in the chat and the question. The ones that I'd mentioned, as well as what was just posted about Grant Finder from Jamie, which I have not used, but I appreciate your sharing that. I think that's where I would start. Again, we've talked about ChatGPT, Gemini, other AI tools. I think it's always helpful if you're trying to sort of think outside the box, like where can I find funding opportunities? What are creative ways I can look for these? you know, ask prompt one of those AI tools to say like, okay, these are the websites or resources I'm already using. Help me fill in the gaps. What am I missing? What are some creative strategies to figure out who in my community or my state provides funding that might be helpful to me and my organization? I would give it some specifics about, you are a grant expert specializing in agriculture, or you're a grants expert specializing in healthcare, and then be specific about the kinds of work that you do. Again, the feedback you may get from AI will not be perfect, but it may jog your thinking. And again, LinkedIn is another great tool. It may not have funding opportunities. I've never found a grant opportunity on LinkedIn, but I've sure found a lot of executive directors and people associated with private philanthropy and nonprofits, which can be a great way to build your network. Never be afraid to just do a cold connect, right? A cold connect is basically you find someone's profile, they're executive director of nonprofit ABC, and you just hit the connect button and you don't even send a message, and again, that's not rude. You're just, offering to connect. And people do that and accept those all the time. That way, if they accept your connection request, you may have the opportunity to, ask a quick question or offer to connect to learn more about what they're doing and, the kinds of work they fund. So, don't be afraid to use some of those existing platforms that you may be on as a professional, or as Jamie mentioned, subscriptions that you already subscribe to within your organization. And then, AI, Google searches, again, those can all be helpful in sort of distilling other avenues for finding funding. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. And then Jenny asked a question a little bit ago. How do you view putting a farm into conservation easement as a funding source to save on taxes?
So thank you for the question. I will be candid and say that I am not a CPA or a farmland easement expert. Um, but I'm going to drop my email in the chat. If you want to email me afterward, I am happy to give you some thoughts about organizations that might be able to give you better expert perspective. Um, Again, I'm familiar broadly with easements and with potential benefits in terms of preventing farmland conversion and potentially having some financial benefits as well. But I definitely don't want to speak out of school, so to speak. So please feel free to shoot me a note, and I think I have some folks who might be able to help.
Great. And then we have a question from Jessica. And I think a lot of people at smaller institutions, particularly 1890s and tribal colleges, can relate. Do you have any tips or advice for very small departments or people who don't have a baseline support you're banking on in some of this? I work for a tribal land grant college, don't have internal partners who can help me make connections, write proposals, vet opportunities. So how does a team of one or two find success looking and applying for these grants?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So thank you first of all. It's a tough one because, well, you already know this is tough. This is not news to you. I think a couple of things to think about. The first consideration might be, what if I could again, using the wave a magic wand analogy, if I could wave a magic wand and make funding happen for one thing, right? Not talking about five things, not talking about 10 opportunities or three different projects. If I had funding for one thing, what would I make possible, right? Um, how much funding would I need? What would the funding be used for? And how would I explain in two sentences the importance of securing that funding for the specific outcome we're working toward? Um, Here's why I think those questions are so important. If you are able to define how much you need, what it's for, and how it gets you to the outcome, I think that relatively quickly starts to get you toward, okay, I know that I don't need to go after a federal grant for $10 million because all I really need is $25,000 to host a series of three workshops for the outcome of providing, education and outreach to native producers who are growing this very specific crop in this specific part of the world. Um, I think what you do by asking those questions is you're sort of narrowing down, like, I don't need to worry about the whole universe of options. What I really need to think about is, what organizations exist in my backyard? And by backyard, it might be your local community, it might be your state, it might be, nonprofits, associations that serve, producers or farmers in a specific part of the world. Again, just using a hypothetical. Um, but if you can articulate, again, how much you need, what it's going to be used for, and especially the outcome, then you can start to think about, okay, um, with the very limited, like non-existent resources that I have, I need to really laser focus on, if I have 5 minutes this week, I want to, use uh, Gemini or Chat GPT, or I want to reach out to three people in my network, right? Three people who I've worked with before who also know this space, and say, hey, if you were in my shoes, a really great question. If you were in my shoes, what is one potential funding source I should consider or I should reach out to? Um, Again, I think figuring out what you're after, first of all, and then thinking about who do you know who could help you speed that process up versus you having to go through all of the hoops and hurdles that may result in no return on investment at the end of the day. Um, Again, really, and the more specific I think you can get on the type of work and the audience that you're serving and where that audience is located, right? So what I'm doing is basically like concentric circles, right? So the first ring of the circle might be like, I want to work with farmers. Then the next ring might be, I want to work with farmers who meet these specific criteria, right? They're between this age and that age. They work in this geography. They have this particular demographic background. They're working with this specific type of crop or livestock. Every time you take an additional cut like that, you're narrowing you're narrowing the research process, right? You're narrowing down exactly what you're after. So again, I know that still takes time, but I think the more, and then, one further exercise might be to help you in that, okay, now that I've got the idea, who do I need to talk to, right? If you can distill down to one page or half a page in Microsoft Word, those details, like who do you want to work with? First of all, I would lead with what are the outcomes? Like, this is what we're driving for. This is the audience that we're going to be serving. This is the amount that we need, and here's how it's going to help us get to that outcome. And then a final piece that you might add would be, tell me in two sentences about your organization and the impact you've already had, giving me specific data points, right? So the amount of funding that you've given back to farmers, the amount of acres you've touched, the amount of educational services you've provided, any of those kinds of data points, you now have a one-page tool you can use to actually give to people in your network or bring to a conference, or again, sort of seek out specific people that might be able to look at that and say, oh, I know exactly who you need to be talking to. Some very small lean organizations have a small budget for a contractor or a consultant, but some don't. And so in that case, when you don't have a budget for that, I think either finding a low cost or free tool, or getting a heuristic like that, right, a one pager of talking points, can actually start helping you outreach. And again, start with people you know, right? Don't feel like you have to start by boiling the ocean, but at any rate, I hope maybe that's helpful. Just I validate that that is a very real concern for many people, and I also validate that you can start with who you know, right? And see where that takes you when you have that very crisply defined, like this is what the outcome we're working toward. So for whatever that's worth, I hope that's helpful. So we
Great.
have about 5, 6 minutes left. What other questions or thoughts might be helpful in addressing here? While we're waiting to see if there's anyone else with a comment to drop into the chat, I did see a comment earlier about some of the approval thresholds that have to be met. So I think the comment was made that within extension, private philanthropy or other funding avenues may be difficult because of the layers of approval that have to be gained from your university, from administrators, etc. Um, those are totally valid and they happen every day. What I would say is, building off of the earlier question around, imagine that sort of you're in a boat and you are trying to get to land. And in this case, we're talking about you're in a boat without the funding that you need, trying to get to shore where the funding exists. Um, at the beginning of the presentation or workshop today, I mentioned this story of going to USDA and USDA saying, "Hey, we'll give you $1 million if you can come up with $1 million in funding from nonprofits, corporations, associations, etc." The happy ending of that story is that with a team, some of which were within our organization, many of which were outside of it and had no prior incentive to help us, we were able to rally a really tremendous coalition and get that funding and put that program to work. It's now been renewed, I think, 2 or 3 times, and has done a lot of really great work on behalf of the American farmer and rancher. But it started with a crazy idea and the courage to try, and a pretty lean team, to be honest. People who were way out of their element. That's nothing to speak on Farm Journal. I'm speaking frankly for myself, right? I didn't know this space. It wasn't new to me at all. It was new to me. So if you are able to put together a document that articulates the outcomes you're after, the funding you need, the reason it's going to help get toward the outcome, and the impact you're already having. One of the things to think about is, I think within any organization, it's easy to get hung up on what has always been true in the past, right? Well, if I were to go after this funding opportunity, I'm going to have to go through 5 layers of red tape. This person doesn't like me, or this person has historically shot down every proposal I've ever made. So why even bother? A couple of things to keep in mind. The past is not necessarily a predictor of the future. So diligence, persistence, the courage to try, I think is really, really powerful, and shouldn't be overlooked. If you think something is that important, then you have every right and agency to push for that, effort to secure that funding, to reach out about that opportunity obviously in a professional way that honors the chain of command. Another thing to consider would be, are there other people within the extension system, within your university and other departments or divisions that could be a collaborator with you, right? So maybe you request a meeting with an administrator and someone else at a university who's done this effectively and worked with that funding partner. Again, I'm thinking about very hypothetical examples, but the idea is, can you provide your leadership, your administration, with social proof, with evidence that this approach has worked in the past for others? Can you provide evidence that this would make the university, the extension system, would give it the credit that it's due for the impact that you're having? Anything you can do to have a conversation about financials, right? How does this improve the financial position of extension, of the impact that you have, of the mission of the university, all of the above? I think the more compelling that proposal is going to be. The more you can visit with senior leaders who have decision-making authority and get other like-minded decision makers to talk to each other. If you have a statement from the administrator of of a collaborating university that's seen this be successful, or if you found a case study that you found in a news article or a video on a website, again, that's not a guarantee or a fail-safe, but I think having evidence of past results, having financial and reputational benefits that would be associated with this kind of funding, that can help you build the case. And again, you may not get the authorization to move forward, but you now have a dossier, if you will, a toolkit that you can use potentially for future funding opportunities that are going to give you more confidence and clarity in describing the work and the outcome and being able to pursue funding, whether it's within your institution or whether it has to be passed on to someone else in the future who has a better shot of securing that funding. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I am very empathetic to the question and appreciate you asking. All right. With 1 minute left, I know many people have to drop off, but I just want to say thank you for your time. I hope this has been helpful. I know there are lots of limitations, and it's very easy to say, like, this is never going to happen. Sounds great, Nate. Love it. But again, I want to be a partner to you. And so if this is something you ever want to talk through, I encourage you to be brave, to be bold, and to, again, think about the resources. I think AI is going to only accelerate our ability, even in one-person teams, to really think creatively and to pursue some of these funding in ways that's not been possible in the past. So, like, I guess my last message would be, don't limit yourself. Like, keep an open mind, give yourself a lot of credit and a lot of grace, and then think about what's the next best step I can do to really articulate the outcome that I believe in my heart we can have at Extension. So with that, Melanie, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Yes, thank you all so much for your participation and your questions and your feedback. I always enjoy these sessions, and Nate offered so much valuable resources and information. So just as a reminder, this will be sent out to everyone who registered and posted. So don't worry about capturing all the links and everything, because I will be sending that to you. Just one more thing. Next month, we're continuing these series, and we will have 2 sessions in August. So we will have crafting compelling proposals and navigating grant challenges. So we'll be continuing to talk about, how we continue to grow and evolve in this grant landscape. So I hope you guys can join us, but thank you so much, and we'll see you guys next time.
Nate, another hit out of the park.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, Molly. I know this one can be so difficult because it can be very discouraging to be in the position where you're like, it's like you against the world and trying to figure out where to even get started. But I appreciate the kind words and I appreciate your participation today.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nate, I agree. I'm so impressed in the way that you are able to field the questions and like be articulate with all your support, like just on the fly. It's really
Oh,
so impressive. And yeah, I think I think everyone leaves like saying like, oh, this was an hour well spent. So I
oh,
appreciate
good.
the thoughtfulness that you put into the presentation and your answers and
Well, thank you,
everything.
Melanie. I
Mhm.
really appreciate that. That means a lot. I'm happy to hear that. And like I said, some of the questions toward the end, it's like my heart aches for them because I know it's got to be so
I
difficult to be in
know.
that position.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
want to leave. I want to be authentic and like acknowledge it is really hard, and there are no clear answers, and it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I also believe, based on what I've seen, that like this is achievable, and you
Yeah.
have more resources and people in your corner than you realize. So
Yeah.
at any rate, I'm
And
hopeful that came through.
and I think it did, and I think it's so helpful it coming from you because I know from working with tribal colleges, it can feel intimidating when you see this information coming from other extension
Sure,
teams and being
sure.
like, oh, I am feel so far away from what they're doing.
Exactly.
So for you to offer support, I think is really helpful. So
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that, Melanie.
mhm,
Thank you so much. Is there anything
thank
else I
you.
can do to be helpful between now and our next session?
I don't think so. I will send you the feedback as we get it, and I'll be in touch for August.
Awesome. That sounds great. Well, Melanie, are you going to, is your DC trip between now and that next session in August?
No, it'll be after.
Later. Okay, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
at any rate, have a great rest of your July and reach out
Yes.
anytime. I look forward to connecting again next month.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you,
All right.
Nate.
See you, Melanie. Bye bye.
Bye.